100 Pounds Down is proudly brought to you by my agency, JKD Global. This is your time to let loose and experience the transformative power of travel. I spent more than a decade as an administrator for a $1 billion nonprofit prior to becoming a travel advisor. So I uniquely understand the demands and pressures of your everyday and the need for restorative experiences that nourish you, mind, body, and soul. From guided tours and luxury cruises, group and solo expeditions, to all inclusive resorts where every detail is taken care of, I design experiences that transcend the ordinary and help you find the balance and renewal you deserve. JKD Global Travel, curating moments of purposeful immersion for professionals to recharge, recenter, and reconnect with what matters most. Start your journey at jkdtravel.com.
Welcome back to 100 Pounds Down, where we preach the gospel of GLP-1 and the word is good. I'm Kristen DiBiase, and after a lifetime of struggling with obesity, I lost over 41% of my body weight on tirzepatide, also known as Mounjaro and Zepbound, and I'm never going back. If you're considering starting anti-obesity medications like this, Ozempic or Wegovy, you're already in the middle of your journey, or you're heading to that maintenance phase and wondering, what comes next? Bring it in. Well, hey, everybody. I have definitely got an update for you today. This will be my first real maintenance-focused video, and the reason that it is the first one is because this is something that's very real and happening right now that I wanted to really talk about with other people that are getting close to maintenance, so you can learn from what happened to me and hopefully maybe be able to stop this from happening to you, or at least be able to be better on guard for it happening to you, so you can try to get back on track as quickly and painlessly as possible. So as you all are all aware, I have mentioned in the past few of my videos that I've done about how I've needed to pull back a little bit so I could kind of stay rested, make sure that I wasn't getting sick, and all of those things, because I do have autoimmune disorders. Well, one of the other things that is an issue that I deal with as well as autoimmune disorders is depression. I do have major depressive disorder, but I generally, for the most part, am able to manage that condition fairly well. I do get into a period of danger when I am burning the candle at both ends. I'm not getting enough rest. When I'm in situations that are really stressful for a prolonged period of time, those are points where I'm more vulnerable to being susceptible to having a depressive episode. Over my lifetime, I've had 4 of those since I turned 18. And for me, there is a certain pattern that comes that at first, I'm not aware of what's going on. And then I very quickly start to recognize that I am going down a path where I'm having depression. For me, I know that that is happening when I start to have a little bit more difficulty in concentrating, in focusing, because I do have ADHD. I also start to feel a bit of disquiet kind of in my soul, where I don't want to be around people. And that's kind of separate from my natural introvert tendencies. I definitely get into a place where I can tell that I am withdrawing, I will, even when I'm around Jason, talk less when he and I are together. And there are a few other things that typically are things that I know to be sign points that I'm kind of tipping toward a depressive episode. But that was probably the one that I started to notice really critically, that was letting me know, hey, we might be going down that road again right now. For me, what was really a bit distressing with this was that it is not at all really following the pattern that I have, or the pattern that I have noticed from the other times that this has occurred. I was talking about it with a colleague of mine the other day and saying that I've been in much more stressful situations than the circumstances I'm currently in, and not been as depressed or not fallen into a depressive episode. And so that was concerning for me, because I was really wondering what was happening. I was thinking, oh, maybe, am I getting into early perimenopause? What's going on? All kinds of things were starting to go through my head. And then it suddenly just clicked on like a light bulb. Duh, it's the medication. But very specifically, it's the fact that I dropped my dosage down because I got to maintenance. And so I laugh a little bit because every time I have a depressive episode, I never realize right away that it's happening. It always takes me a little bit before I start to see enough of those breadcrumbs and I start to see the pattern and realize that that's what's happening. But this time I really just was caught off guard by this, and I don't know why I was, because if I had been thinking about this in a kind of rational manner, I would have remembered that when I started taking the medication, once I got up to a certain dosage, which for me was about the point when I got to 12.5, I want to say. When I got up to 12.5, I actually had to tweak a bit because the way that I was starting to feel was kind of tipping me in a different direction, where I was starting to feel very irritable all of a sudden. And that's not how I normally am. This is hard for me to talk about. I really don't have difficulty talking about mental health. It's something that I'm pretty open about. I'm very open about that with my students as well, because that is such an important piece for them as they are going through their educational journeys in law school. Mental health is one of the most critical things that you have to be watching, because we already know that the legal profession churns out people who have mental health struggles, and it makes mental health struggles worse for people who come into law school and legal education with mental health struggles. And so I'm I'm pretty radically open about mental health, my own, and willing to talk about that if there are others that need an ear or want to hear perspectives. But one of the pieces that is difficult is, because it's happening to you, you just don't catch it right away. And so, as I was saying, the reason I should have known was because of how things were going as I was starting to take the medication. For me, I have a serotonin deficiency. I have a genetic deficiency in serotonin. So I don't get as much serotonin as the average person gets. So that is the underlying cause of my depression. And I also honestly believe that that's also the underlying cause of my obesity, my metabolic dysfunction, all of those things. And the reason for that is that science has shown, there are studies that have proven that there is a comorbidity often, and there's a commonality between mood disorders and also metabolic disorders or cardiometabolic disease. Um, those two things are what they call bidirectional. So in medicine, this idea of something being a bidirectional association is where there are multiple conditions, and those conditions are not only influenced by each other, but they also contribute to each other. So it's kind of this feedback loop where one is causing the other, and then the other is causing the other, and they kind of go in a vicious circle and kind of influence each other back and forth. And so there's pretty well established science that says that major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, mood disorders of that sort, there is a bi-directional association between those and metabolic dysfunction, metabolic disorders, those types of things. And the reason for that is because of, in various individuals, their particular genotype is such that it is kind of setting up that correlation. Your genotype is really simply it's your specific DNA sequence. So it's, everyone has their, their set of genetics, but you get genetic material from both of your parents. So again, this is that idea where we're talking about, the four squares, and there's the capital letters and the lowercase letters, and then the combinations of those two, one lower, one upper, one lower, and all of the combinations of genetics that can cause. So that's really, your genotype is just the very, very specific formula of mixes of those genetic letters that are your specific DNA. Now, your phenotype is then basically the expression of your genotype. So when we take a person's DNA string, what do those genetic pieces then look like for that person? What is the expression of those genes? So a really good example, a phenotypical trait would be if a person has brown eyes or not. The genetics for brown eyes, if one parent has brown eyes and one parent has blue eyes, the genetics that would come together to make their offspring, their child, have brown eyes, Both parents would have to have at least one piece of their, genetics, at least one allele that would be one that could make someone have a brown eye for a brown-eyed parent and a blue-eyed parent to produce a brown-eyed child. So I'm explaining all of this because when we look at the science, the reason that major depressive disorder, bipolar, and other mood disorders are bidirectionally associated with these metabolic and cardiometabolic issues is because they are what is called pleiotropic traits. Um, Pleiotropic or pleiotrophy is basically where there's a gene, and a gene can cause a genetic trait, but it can also cause other genetic traits. And those traits aren't really linked to each other in any specific way. So I'm completely making this up right now, but say the same gene that causes a person to have brown eyes also would be a gene that causes someone to be able to sing really well. Just completely making this up. Those really don't have anything to do with each other, but the same gene is the one that is involved in influencing whether or not those two things would occur. And so that is the situation when it comes to mood disorders and these kind of metabolic types of issues. There is a handful of different genes that are heavily implicated in those conditions taking place. And I happen to know for a fact that I definitely have a deficiency in one of those types of genes because I've had genetic testing before. So, all that said, when I started taking this medication, early on, I started to feel different. For me, because I do struggle with depression, I know I'm pretty sure that the reason that I do is because of my major serotonin deficiency. But one of the things that can cause that is the different, genetic markers. And so this medication for me has definitely been something that has been replacing some of that serotonin, I believe, because my mood has really improved over the time that I've been taking this. I remember when I was starting this medication, after probably about a month, I could really tell a difference, and that I was genuinely happy. For me, as a person who tends toward depression kind of naturally because of my genetic makeup, the medication that I take usually keeps me quite neutral. And that's because one of the things that's kind of weird about having the particular deficiency that I have is that my receptors, there's a problem with kind of how they work. My doctor kind of explained it as if serotonin receptors are mouths, I have less mouths to eat serotonin than the average person has in their body. And the mouths that I do have are smaller than the average size of the mouths that people have to eat serotonin. So my receptors are fewer, and they are also like either kind of like smaller, or they're just less sensitive. They don't pick up as well. So for me, medication that I take is in order to keep me from kind of dipping into depression. Just on a regular basis because I have a chemical imbalance in my neurotransmitters. Um, but because I also have ADHD, it's a very kind of unique dance for me, pharmacologically speaking, that I have to navigate. I do need something to help with my ADHD, and Adderall was too much because my ADHD, my executive function, it's not based on a dopamine problem. I don't have problems with dopamine. I have problems with serotonin. And so if you take Adderall, Adderall can, in someone who doesn't really have a dopamine problem, give you too much dopamine. And often when people take dopamine, causing agents and they don't need to, that and the abuse of Adderall can look like bipolar 2 mania. So it can kind of spin you up and give you a drug induced mania or hypomania. And so that is something that I have to watch for. So there's a very kind of narrow band in which my chemical makeup stays kind of steady. And so for me, I'm not allowed to take SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Um, Examples of SSRIs would be like Zoloft. And taking Zoloft was how we then learned, and I ended up getting genetic testing to find out that I can never take SSRIs ever again. I think I'd mentioned before, but when I was put on Zoloft, I gained a lot of weight very, very quickly. And it was real weight. And the reason that that happened is, again, because of this pleiotropic effect of the same genetics that are kind of dealing with my serotonin issue also being the same type of genetics that impact metabolic disorders. So in not being able to take SSRIs, I do take an SNRI, which is a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. And that keeps things kind of even for me so I don't dip into depression. But I do have to really watch and make sure that I'm still really carefully monitoring my health. I'm monitoring my amount of stress because I do have kind of all of these other comorbid conditions with my autoimmune disorder, other chronic illness pieces that kind of come into play with all of that. And so for me, being on the medication that I am on, I am never in a happy mood. And so when I talk about mood, I like to talk about mood in terms of weather and climate. I very clearly, I do have moments of joy in, you know, in real time. If something is funny, I think it's funny. If something is making me happy, I feel happy in that moment. I don't have a problem with my emotional weather, so to speak. But my emotional climate, generally, my mood tends to sit very neutral, and that's fairly artificial because of the medication that I take. If I didn't take the medication, I would just kind of always be a little bit down and depressed because of my chemical makeup. And so I noticed, and I was telling Jason when I first was on the medication, on the GLP-1s for about a month, that I realized that I was happy. Like the weather was happy, but the climate too was actually happy. If you are not sure, um, whether or not you can kind of tell the difference between emotional weather and emotional climate. I like to say, if you are happy for no reason, for no good reason, there's nothing particularly good happening in the moment, but you feel happy, then that is more indicative of your emotional climate than your emotional weather. And so my emotional climate was changing for the better. It was very positive, and I've not had kind of that positive emotional climate in many, many years. I was a teenager, honestly, the last time that I had an emotional climate of happiness. And that's because, at that point, I was much younger. And so I hadn't had that cumulative effect over years and years of having the deficiencies that I had when I was a teenager. My autoimmune disorders had not yet expressed themselves. Things were much different then. And so I've really enjoyed being able to feel that happiness in my emotional climate since I've been on this medication. It really has been a life changing experience being on this medication for multiple reasons. Now, having had that occur, sometimes I just kind of have to laugh at myself because it's again one of those things that's so obvious. It's been there all along and I just don't realize it until it kind of strikes me. I got all the way up to 15 milligrams on this medication. And now that I'm in maintenance, I came down. And so one of the reasons that I made some of the choices that I made was because, when we're doing the route that we are doing, um, the amount of medication that comes in a vial, when we are taking it is, it's divisible depending on what dosage you are taking. But so for me to get the best utility out of the vial that I'm currently using, I could go from 15 milligrams to 10 milligrams and get an additional 2 weeks of use out of the same vial. And 10 milligrams is my maintenance dose. That's the dose for which, if I'm taking that dosage, I am not gaining. If I am watching correctly, kind of what I am eating, I will stay around the same weight. I was able for 4 weeks straight to maintain at 145 pounds and some odd ounces, without really moving beyond that number before we went on vacation, of course. Um, and so I know that this is the right dosage for me in maintenance. But what I was absolutely not tracking on at all was the fact that I had definitely decreased my dosage. And I wasn't really thinking about the possible impact that that might have on my mental health. And so as I started to kind of dip down into having some of that um, depressive feeling because I made a big jump, I wasn't really tracking on it at all. And so I noticed, all of my little tells started to happen. I was realizing, slowly kind of dawning on me, oh, I'm having a depressive episode. And that's kind of how I got into the place of trying to figure out what is going on, what's wrong, why is this occurring? And so now that I figured it out, I'm definitely in a much better place. I have 4 the past 2 weeks been, um, you know, working on kind of changing some things with my stabilization medication. I'm, on the dosage that is right to kind of turn things back to a good place where I'm not as labile. That means my mood is not kind of bouncing as much, because I was having periods where I'd be having happy weather, but then I would suddenly feel like I wanted to cry, um, for honestly no really good reason either. Um, and again, the stress that I am or that I was currently undergoing with, being in graduation season and having lots of things to do, and having one of my colleagues move on for a great promotion to a new position, but he left our team. Um, those are things that I've experienced multiple times before. I've experienced things like that, plus other things on top of those, and it had not thrown me as much as I was being thrown this time. And so now we know why. And so for me, getting my medication kind of stabilized to combat that change. But now me being able to really kind of settle back in, I'm feeling a lot better. I knew that I was kind of dipping down when we came back from our trip, and I did not feel like I was at 100%. And so for me, usually, one of the things that I do every year is after, the graduation, Jason and I go on a trip. And that is to just kind of leave our cares behind, kind of recoup, get our energy back. We usually have a great time. I usually feel rested when I come back, and I did not feel like the meter had been recharged all the way up to 100%, when I got back. And that was when I was really starting to realize, wait, I think I'm having a depressive episode. And that definitely, as we're kind of looking back, just the amount that I was sleeping a bit more, I was just taking it really easy, not doing as much when we were on the ship. All of those pieces put together were pretty big signs. And so now that it's been a few weeks since we got back, I'm feeling a ton better, a lot more even keel. I've still been taking it easy and making sure that I'm getting more rest so I can kind of build my reserves back up. And I'm also feeling good and stabilized now at this 10 milligram dosage. So that is the story of kind of what happened with me as I went into maintenance. And what can you do if you are getting ready to go into maintenance or you've just started maintenance? I mean, what would I do if I had this on my radar ahead of time? A few things. I think that if you aren't, absolutely do mood tracking. And again, it's been delayed because I had the depression, and I couldn't really do anything beyond, just my job, um, during some of this time. But my GLP-1 tracking journal, I am still doing some of the programming in there, so all of those pieces can work as intended. And that's the part that I'm trying to get finalized to be able to get that out. But even if you are not interested in using mine, some type of tracking mechanism where you can track how your mood is from day to day. Simple journaling could also be something that would work with that as well. That will give you something you can look back on and say, is this normal? Is this outside of my regular pattern of how I've been feeling, how I've been reacting to other people? You know, is this a weather thing? Was that warranted based on the situation that I was in? Or is this feeling like a change in my climate? That's one thing that I would definitely do if I were going into this and absolutely aware that this could possibly cause some depression. Another thing that I would absolutely recommend for anyone is I would not, if I had to do this over again, and if you are getting ready to, um, do not kind of make that jump down from a higher dosage, and skip doses down. I know that on the way up, a lot of us were forced to maybe have to do that because of the shortages, especially. Um, and that can cause some issues for people, but I think probably if you're a person who is, prone to mood disorder or has a history of depression, the negative type of impact that you're going to have is going to be more likely if you are jumping doses going back down than jumping doses going up. So that's the second thing that I would definitely recommend for anyone who could be susceptible to having some mental health struggles as you go into maintenance. Absolutely do, honestly, at minimum, the reverse of what you did when you titrated up. In the same way that when we first started out on this medication, we started on that lowest dose, that 2.5 dose, and you had to be on it for, almost a month, for 4 weeks of injections before you could move up to the next dosage. I would highly recommend you do the same thing wherever you are coming down from when you are entering into maintenance. Really go down only to the next immediate lowest dose and stay on that dosage for at least 4 week long rounds. So at least, about a month before trying to continue titrating down to the next dosage after that. Um, Another thing I definitely would recommend, and this is something I actually did do, and I think that's why I was lucky enough, even though I did tip into this kind of depressive episode, this entire situation was no longer than about 6 weeks total, um, because it's not going to happen right away. It really took some time cumulatively, and it also took other inciting factors like the stress on top of me going down. So it was multiple factors kind of coming together as a perfect storm that caused it for me, and it didn't happen right away. So that's the other piece. I would definitely be working with your therapist or your counselor if you have one. And that's something that I absolutely did do this entire time. I've been regularly in communication with both, my psych prescriber for my medication and my psychologist, my therapist, throughout this process. And so we were doing all of those other things besides just the medication management piece, in order to make sure that I was navigating how I was feeling as best as possible under the circumstances that I was in. Another thing that I would definitely recommend for people is to be kind to yourself. That was probably the number one thing that my therapist and I really worked on, because for me, there's a lot of kind of self-flagellation that goes on when I feel like I'm faltering and not getting the things done that I want to get done, that I don't have as much energy around goals that I'm trying to meet or things that I'm trying to do. And you have to recognize that these periods of time will happen on occasion, and you have to be kind to yourself when those happen. For me, it's a matter of recognizing that I'm in one of those times and being kind to myself and reminding myself that this period is not forever. It will pass. And the things that I want to do, the goals that I am trying to achieve will be there for me to continue to strive for once I get past that period. But the thing that is so critical to be able to do those is that I have to be back in a good place, within myself in order to be able to do that. And so it's one of those things where even though I'm very frustrated around it, I do really still try to adhere to that, because I know that if I push myself too hard, it'll only backfire and lead to more frustration for me down the road. So that's why there was almost maybe even actually a month, between the last video that I did and the video before that one. That's kind of what was happening behind the scenes with me as I was dealing with the unforeseen, but maybe didn't need to be unforeseen if I'd kind of really thought that kind of through, situation of what can happen when you are starting, to titrate down in maintenance. For people who are thinking, okay, if I titrate down, there could be that risk. Um, One, if you did not feel a change in your emotional climate on the way up, I I don't know that you necessarily will have an issue as you are coming back down. But if you are a person who definitely did notice that you had kind of a change in your emotional climate, and it was a positive one, you'll want to be very careful, and just watch yourself closely, as you are titrating down. Now, for people who are thinking, okay, well, if that is a possibility that I might have to contend with, what if instead of titrating down, I just instead stayed on the same dosage and tried to kind of lengthen the period of time, between taking the medication? There are some people that are trying that, and this is kind of one of the two different camps or approaches to how to do maintenance. Um, Based on what I have read in all of the literature and what I know of how, the pharmacokinetics of this medication works, we know that this medication generally has a 5-day half life. The half life is essentially the point at which you have reached the maximum capacity, of a medication dosage. And from that point onward, you will start to see kind of a decline in the efficacy of the medication. So with a 5-day half-life, that's why, some people, as they are coming up to their next shot day, some people will start to feel a little bit of food noise maybe starting to creep in a little. Some people will feel a little bit hungrier in the couple days that are leading up to when they get their next shot, and that's the reason why. Because the half life is about 2 days prior to when the next time a person would be taking the shot. And so knowing about the half life and how that works, I am myself, I'm not a fan of the idea of stretching out the length of time between when you're taking your doses. Um, I personally am of the opinion that doing that is causing a lot more up and down kind of in your hormonal levels in your body. If you're a person who is more sensitive to that up and down within your hormonal responses, I would definitely probably not recommend that approach. If you're someone who is not really noticing a ton of up and down with your hormones, maybe you can stand that a bit better. But you get to a point where if, the half life is 5 days, right? Then the ultimate kind of wear off of the medication would be 10 days. Because we're saying, the half life is 5. So if you were to double that at the 10-day mark, there's kind of the end that dosage of the medication has essentially pooped out. It's not really giving any benefit. Obviously, because of the way this medication works and the restorative and reparative properties that it has, that's not to say that your body immediately is just going to completely revert, because you've been healing and repairing it all along. And so, if you got to 11 days, you're not like a person who's never been on this medication before. It's not like that. But that active dosage that you just took, that dose is not really doing anything anymore. It is essentially that dose is worn off by the time you hit like day 11. Yeah, having said that, I mean, if we were thinking about the timing of that, and there are people who are not as susceptible to what happens when your hormones are kind of moving up and down. Basically, like, you can go 10 days because of the way the half-life works and the ultimate tail end of that medication. But again, if you're a person where you are quite sensitive to that, titrating down is probably going to be a better option for you, instead of, bouncing around back and forth by staying at a high dose, but lengthening the amount of time between those doses. And within that recommendation, I think that also you and your clinician have to take into account your previous history and your specific situation in terms of, how much metabolic dysfunction did you have before, and how badly was that impacting you. I feel, as a rule, the worse the dysfunction was before you started the medication, the more argument I see in favor of continuing on a weekly basis, but then titrating your dosage down to a minimally effective dose, the dose that lets you stay where you are, but still gives you that feeling of not having the food noise and all of that. So that would be my recommendation for anyone who's thinking of doing one versus the other. So that's the tea on a situation that could possibly happen to you if you are someone who noticed an improvement in mood when you started taking your GLP-1 medications. I hope that being able to share my story and what I learned the hard way from this will be able to help someone else be on the lookout to take care of themselves and maybe prevent this from happening to you at all, or be able to catch it as it's happening and work with your prescriber to either get medication that will help to level you out in that way, or other things that can kind of help you manage that change due to going back down to a lower dosage of the medication. If you think that weight loss injections could be right for you, definitely talk to your medical professional, preferably an endocrinologist or an obesity medicine specialist, because those are the doctors who know these kinds of medications the best. As always, I am not a doctor. I am not a representative of or sponsored by any pharmaceutical company. I'm just one woman who's sharing her personal experiences and opinions on these matters. And if you find the content that I'm putting out on this channel helpful, please take a moment to hit that trifecta and like, subscribe, notifications, and we'll see you on the other side.